Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry P. Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. Also at the Hillsdale College Podcast Network, check out the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, The Larry P. Arnn Show, and more, all at podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Morning, glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. Earlier this week, I was on the campus of Hillsdale College. I'm back now with Dr. Arnn remotely, and we are back in Volume 3 of Churchill's History of World War I. And unfortunately, Volume 3, very early on, goes to Verdun. And Verdun is one of the most awful things I've ever read about. So I'm going to start by Dr. Arnn by saying, is it the worst battle of World War I, or is there something even worse than Verdun?
The Battle of the Somme, which overlapped with it, was larger casualties. But Verdun was just two nations, and the Somme was many. And it's a place in northern France, not far from the Belgian border, and the Germans attacked there and took a fort, and they just the road that the French used to resupply is called now the Sacred Road, because so many people went to their deaths over this road. And I wanted to tell a little story. I had a great teacher named Harry Newman, who was a self-professed nihilist and a tremendous teacher. You had to read a book with him. He was extremely instructive. We read Nietzsche, and we read the moderns, and we read Aristophanes. So he was great. Well, he was of German extraction, and his father or grandfather was in the Battle of Verdun.
Oh.
And he was a hard man to know, although he was a delight to learn from. But Professor Jaffa, who knew him very well and conducted many classes with him, told me once that every year on the anniversary of the Battle of Verdun, Harry Newman would go into a deep funk, because the whole honor of the German and the whole honor of the French people got enrolled in that battle. And they poured massive numbers of troops and shells and guns. And if you go to Verdun, which I have done, it is the only battlefield of the First World War or the Second World War that I've been on that still looks like a battlefield, because the holes made by the shells are simply ubiquitous. It is just a pockmarked landscape around those hills over which they fought.
Can I give the numbers so that our audience knows the numbers here, what we're talking about? The battle begins in February of 1916. It doesn't end till May. In the course of that, the French have 179,000 killed, 283,000 wounded. The Germans have 72,000 killed and 206,000 wounded. That's such an astonishing number compared to with what we deal with in Israel, say in Gaza, or in our war in Afghanistan that went for 20 years. It's impossible actually for a modern audience to understand that kind of a list of casualties. No wonder he went into a funk, Dr. Arnn.
Yeah, and see, that's sort of like the war, too, because the Germans took it, and then the French took it back, and that was harder, once it's entrenched in the First World War, in the Civil War, too, by the way. That's where the casualties were, right? You charge against machine guns and barbed wire and artillery, and you're going to lose a lot of people, and you might not take the ground. And see, at this time, the Battle of the Somme is beginning, and that's, my wife's grandfather was in that battle and was a shattered man for the rest of his life. But the British were saying at this time, you need to just go on the defensive here and come and join this battle. We're trying to move the Germans across a wider front. that battle too failed. And that's where, in that battle, that's where the British took the most of the most intensive loss of life in the whole war. And they were on the offensive, and Churchill didn't want them to be. He wanted them to hold until they figured out some other way than attacking these trenches. And the Verdun was a great tragedy, and it was, you could see where the energy came from for this terrible war, right? It was honor and pride, which are not bad things unless they're unrestrained. And both nations invested enormous reserves of those things in this battle to great, great loss.
One of the factors in that, I did not know until I read this. I had never heard of the Crown Prince of Germany, who was the Kaiser's son. And the Kaiser's son, the Kaiser is running Germany. This is Weimar Republic. It's pre-Hitler. It's run by a king, the Kaiser Wilhelm II. And he has his son, the Crown Prince. And the Crown Prince is in charge of Verdun. I didn't know that. And obviously, pride's going to get mixed up in that if you're the Crown Prince, but also ineptitude, because the generals who were on the German side didn't think much of the Crown Prince. So Churchill writes a lot about his becoming the fall guy undeservedly. Churchill actually has sympathy for the Crown Prince of Germany, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, well, Churchill was, he thought that monarchy was the source of stability. And he thought that, he wrote a lovely thing about Daddy, Willem II, his father, the Crown Prince's father. And the point is, Kaiser Wilhelm II was not up to the level of events. And here's what happened, right? First of all, they inherit all this. They inherit a Germany. Wilhelm I, his father, built Germany out of many German states and part of Austria through a series of wars in the 1860s and 70s. And that was bold, and he had the great Bismarck as his counselor. But now Wilhelm II comes along, and he inherits a great nation. And so one of the attitudes, if you're Wilhelm I, the generals look at you, and you're the man who built all this. And you used them to do it, and they are your servants. Well, the kid comes along, and is he a servant of them? Is he going to do great things? Because we're all here now, and our fathers built all this. Are we going to build it bigger? Are we going to follow our fathers? Are you up to that? And what he should have been saying to them was no. And he probably lacked the power to do it. He certainly lacked a counselor of the ability of Bismarck, who was unusual, singular. Everybody today, we lack such talent, probably. So and now his kid's down there, and his kid's got to win honor, see? And he took a big fortress. It's a significant fortress. And that's really great. Now you got to hold it. And so, yeah, that all of that, in my opinion, in Churchill's opinion, it was Churchill's opinion, he states it in this book, that was misplaced. But so was the bigger battle going on up to the north and east from there, the Battle of the Somme. The worst day in British military history is Passchendaele. It's a few days. And the British lost 10,000 a day for several days in that thing. And,
that's
over
such
a million, almost a million
number. When you say your grandfather-in-law was a shattered man, what does that mean?
Well, my wife's family are lawyers back to the time of the American Revolution. And in fact, they came with William the Conqueror. They're French. I always tell them that, and they're
I'm sure that endears them.
And they settled in Lancashire, and they were there. They've been there for more than, for close to a millennium. And since the American Revolution, they had a law firm up there, and Houghton, Craven, and Dixon. And there was always a Houghton, a Craven, and a Dixon in it until 1988 when my wife's daddy retired. And then Dennis Houghton and Teddy Craven and whatever Dixon's name was, and Teddy Dixon and the Tony Craven, they all had children who were lawyers, and none of them joined the firm.
Oh,
my wife's brother didn't join the firm, and that's because Britain was changing. Right, he went down south.
Well, my dad's firm goes back until the early 1800s, and I wouldn't join it either because I didn't want to stay in Warren, Ohio. It happens. It does happen, and more is going to happen on the Hillsdale Dialogue. Don't go anywhere except to HughForHillsdale.com. HughFor Hillsdale.com. HughForHillsdale.com. I'll be back with Dr. Arnn right after this as the Hillsdale Dialogue continues. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. Stay tuned.
Hey, it's Scott Bertram, and I've got a challenge for you today. Become a better educated American citizen. And to help you do just that, we at Hillsdale College have our free online courses available for all who wish to learn. Our challenge? Take just one of our courses. There are so many to choose from. You can discover the beauty of the Bible and the Genesis story, study the writings of C.S. Lewis, or explore the true meaning of America in Constitution 101. We have dozens more to choose from, and all these self-paced free courses feature Hillsdale faculty and scholars, many you've heard on this podcast. So visit hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE, and pick one of the more than 30 free Hillsdale courses. I hope you'll accept my challenge. Pick whichever course you like and become a more educated citizen today. Go to hillsdale.edu/course, COURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/course.
Welcome back, America. The Hillsdale Dialogue underway. Last radio hour of the week, I'm talking with Dr. Larry Arnn. In fact, I'm talking with Dr. Arnn about Arkansas and our dads. We're pretty far afield, but we come back.
My wife's grandfather built the house, quite a nice house, called the Stone House. It had a pipe organ in it. The church, when he was building the house, he went past a church and they had discarded their pipe organ, and he installed it in the house. And so it was a kind of a grand house. They're not aristocracy, but they're country gentry. And Grandpa is the one who brought them to their peak, I think. And he was a heck of a lawyer and, a pillar of the community, as was my wife's father. Well, he's in the Lancashire Gunners, and he was the lieutenant colonel, as was my wife's father in the same regiment later. And they're artillery, and they're attached to the Coldstream Guards, and so they have bad wars. They get sent to bad places because there are five guards regiments, and they're the best. And so he was in all the battles of the Somme. And by account, my wife didn't know him very well. She was born after the Second World War because marriages were delayed. And I think she met him. I'm not remembering that. But the stories of him are that he was a broken man after the war, and he'd been a great man before. Interestingly enough, my wife's father was in the Battle of Dunkirk, left the beach the last day anybody did. Then he went to Singapore, and he was captured, and he was a Japanese POW for 2.5 years, and he was the camp commander. He was not shattered by the war. And that is a kind of difference in the war, those wars. Britain was bankrupted by the Second World War. They had Winston Churchill to lead, and he squeezed every inch out of them and helped to save the world. But their casualties were only about a third what they were in the First World War. And that's also partly because when Churchill was in charge. Churchill stands under the charge that he didn't want to do Normandy. He actually did want to do Normandy. What he didn't want to do was the Battle of the Somme.
I got that. Yeah, I got to ask you.
Normandy, they were able to make it work.
Well, we're on this. When we look at last week we talked briefly about the British Conservative Party, the Tories, And Churchill, of course, was a Tory, and he was involved in both of these wars. He wrote all these books. Would Winston Churchill recognize anything about the modern Tory party? I mean, would he say, that man is my heir, that woman is my heir?
Well, some things, I mean, it depends, right? Churchill helped to invent the social safety net, and they're big on that. They've turned it into something where you don't have to work. That he would not like. The thing that he invented in 1909, which was altered fundamentally in 1945 when the socialists came in, but the thing that he invented was a savings insurance system that gave people a lot of security and attached it to their work, you see. And, you know, there's always been welfare in America. Sometimes it was all right from the beginning in the colonial America, right? And it has emphasized work, not so much today, and that's what's wrong with it. If somebody has a misfortune, there should be a national insurance plan to take care of them. And there would be no reason for that to bankrupt the nation, right? Because you can save. It's a rich country. Put the resources aside for that, and people should contribute to them. And if, you know, in other words, work is a condition of life and therefore of citizenship. Churchill was for that.
I am for work, too. Everyone should be for work. I'm always for work. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. We're deep into 2016 now, and Winston Churchill has harsh things to say about French command and control of their armies as the Battle of Verdun gets underway. Dr. Arnn is with me. All things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu, all prior Hillsdale Dialogues can be found at Hugh, H-U-G-H-F-O-R, Hillsdale.com, HughforHillsdale.com. Is Winston Churchill mocking Joffrey in this chapter, by your account? It seems to me that his girth and his imperturbability is often mentioned, and that it's purposely mentioned, and that perhaps Churchill doesn't think he had the energy necessary to run this kind of a war. What do you think?
Both energy and vision, right? Churchill, you know, one thing to know about this war is that, you know, Churchill had very great respect for his country and its military efforts, and he didn't undercut them. On the other hand, he's at odds with the generals more than not throughout the war. And he has a different idea. And of course, this book that we're reading, if you go back to the greatest chapter in this book in volume 2, called The Deadlock in the West, that's a microcosm of Churchill's thoughts about war. Wars are won by a combination of slaughter and maneuver, and the greater the general, the more he contributes in maneuver, and the less he extracts in slaughter. And so Churchill thought that a free country, to remain free, has to leave resources in the hands of ordinary people, to do with as they please, and to make their own lives under their own initiative as they please. That's what freedom means. And so if you conscript everything into a war, and that verb to conscript, Churchill uses that repeatedly in reference to the modern state, that it conscripts us for all kinds of emergencies, domestic and foreign. That's why the American people are war weary, although we have not suffered major casualties in any war. In, you know, even Vietnam and Korea, that's 50,000, but, you know, not the 250,000 we lost in the Second World War, nor the 600,000 we lost in the Civil War. But we have spent enormous financial and political energy on a series of wars that have gone on since Reagan left office, and not while he was in office. Do you credit
the returning strength of Donald Trump at all, or in significant part, or maybe a majority of the fact that he is against adventures abroad? He's against war abroad. I mean, he really is. I think he would send the weapons to Ukraine.
Well, I don't know if he would or not. The question there's no question who's in the right, Ukraine versus Russia. There's some question about whether we're in the right, because some people say, and I don't know myself, that we might have made a deal with Russia to give them the Russian-speaking parts of the Ukraine, and that might have avoided all this. And if that's true and we didn't do it, that's a shame. My one big question about Ukraine is that we're obviously running out of bullets, and we're spending bullets, and we're not taking urgent steps to rectify that first fact.
On that point, I talked to Ambassador Markarova on Tuesday of this week, and she wants Patriot missiles because they're getting apartment buildings blown up, and Raytheon's not sending enough Patriot missiles. And that, to me, is a very easy to fix, because we're always going to need Patriot missiles. All of our allies are going to need them. We're going to need them. Why aren't we building more of them, Dr. Arnn? I mean, I would run on the Arsenal of Democracy platform if I were Donald Trump. Why are we not?
Yeah, well, he does. And remember, our manufacturing base is greatly eroded now.
Yes, it is.
I mean, we have to wake up and see that as the world has grown, right, and it has grown very greatly, then our relative strength has declined. And also our absolute strength has declined. And so in relation to the world, we are weaker than we've been since the Second World War.
Two big points to make.
We need to be...
Two big points to make.
I mean, look.
We are weaker.
Walk softly and carry a big stick. Aren't we walking loudly and carrying a small stick?
And we're out of ammunition.
Backwards.
Yeah, we're walking loudly.
Yeah,
we're talking loudly, and we're out of ammunition. All right, two last points.
Yeah, I think.
In the middle of this disastrous battle at Verdun, for everyone, it becomes a propaganda war, and the Germans are persuaded they've lost. That's good. But Briand, a guy named Briand, becomes the French prime minister, and unity of front is his slogan. Only one front, and Churchill quotes him, "The whole great circle of fire and steel within gripping the Central Powers was one front." That's a strategic concept. I think we have one front right now, again, with China, Russia, and Iran. And I don't think we get it. I wish people would read this, because until you understand it's all one front, you really can't have a strategy. Churchill is underscoring that here.
Yeah, and we should be thinking about breaking up that front.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
I'm just, I don't, I'm not an expert on this, and the only hard position I've taken, and it's very hard, is that if you're running out of bullets and you're waging war all over the world, then you need to have a national emergency and start building bullets. And, Tom Cotton agrees with that.
That's why, if Cotton were the vice president, that would be a very reassuring appointment to people like you and me.
It would be, yeah. And, then that's honest. And see, the other thing is, it gives people a chance to decide, right? Do we want to fight those wars? This is what they cost. You see?
And by the way, that goes for Joni Ernst and J.D. Vance and Mike Pompeo. People, that's why I want a soldier. I really want a soldier, because they know what happens when you run out of ammunition. They're well skilled in that situation. It's not theoretical.
So anyway, that and see, Winston Churchill. We talked about this in the past. He starts getting worried about Hitler in 1930-31, and from then consistently until 1938, when the Czech crisis arises, he doesn't want to fight. He wants to build weapons, right? More airplanes than the Germans, you see. And we're seeing in these chapters that we're going to talk about next week, we will see that the value of the British Navy has greatly depreciated by the new conditions of war. And they can't fight those old wars over again where their Navy was dominant.
Yeah, amen.
It's not
People
possible.
need to remember that. You can't fight the last war. Got to ask you, have you watched Masters of the Air yet?
Oh, yeah.
So my uncle was in one of those
really great
bombers. It's really great. And they're all irrelevant to what we're doing now, because the next war, and I keep telling my son-in-law, who's a carrier man, I'm not sure your carrier is going to be relevant much beyond 20 years from now, because it does seem to me like if you fight the last war, you're doomed. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think China has had 2 human generations now to get ready to defeat the American military as it is. And many of the weapons that they've invented to do that are famous. And we're behind in some of them.
Right.
And
last question for this segment. Churchill.
You've got to expect.
Yeah, they've got to be ready.
Yeah, remember, I want to make one point about your one front point. First of all, China and Russia and Iran are natural enemies, and we should be giving serious thought and action to breaking up that alliance, because in the end, after they defeat us, they're not going to get along. There's nothing in those countries that make them friends. And so we should be exploiting that, thinking of ways to do that, because in that beautiful 3 pages that I call people's attention to yet again in The Deadlock of the West, when he defines what maneuvers are, he says that maneuvers include changing the direction of an ally. You see? In other words, there's enormous, I don't think that we're ever going to get along with Iran. I think that they're militant and crazy.
That's interesting, because I would have thought the country most likely to change right now is Iran, because the Iranian people have tried to change it themselves 4 times. They hate these guys.
Yeah, in other words, regime change, right? And,
yes.
And so there are some people I know who are very smart who think that China is not an expansionist militant power. I don't know that I agree with that. They think that China has never been a martial nation, one of them says to me, and that its purposes are not conquest of Europe, although they want heavy influence there, and they're getting it. But so maybe you don't have to fight China. Maybe what you do is you ally along the coast of Eurasia with the alliances that we've got and try to preserve them. And Russia, they're bound to have trouble with China. And the Russian resources are out there in the far east of Russia, where the Chinese are near and the Russian population is actually not near. And so maybe obviously we should be looking to exploit those natural fissures.
Exploit natural fissures and do a few other things. Head over to hillsdale.edu. We'll come back and finish the conversation with Dr. Arnn after the break.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Dr. Arnn and I will continue talking now, but I want to remind you all things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu. And I also want to remind you that all of our prior dialogues, every one of them, are available at hillsdale.com. I found out this week that iTunes, among others, only count the podcasts for the benefit of Hillsdale if you click on it and listen to a few minutes of it. So please, at least you might not like the topic for that week, or you might love the topic for that week. Give it a listen before you let it pile up in your podcast line. And do subscribe and do rate us. Hugh for Hillsdale.com will get you to all the Hillsdale Dialogues, as will just typing in Hillsdale and iTunes. It'll take you right there. We are talking about Europe. Post-Putin, we've got to get Russia back into Europe. post-Putin. I don't think we can deal with a war criminal. Last question, because Russia comes up. Churchill, in this chapter on Verdun, writes, takes us over to the Eastern Front. Says all one war. He doesn't want us to forget the Eastern Front, and he writes, the Russian armies, quote, suffered from one fatal deficiency which no Allied assistance could remedy. Educated men who could read and write. It had never occurred to me that if your troops can't read and write, they're not going to be very, very useful to you in an electronic war. I mean, in any war, but especially in an electronic war. I'm not sure we're spending a lot of time educating people in the country anymore, Dr. Arnn. This goes back to the Hillsdale Classical School.
I think the facts about American education are embarrassing, right? I mean, we're at the bottom of the developed world in reading and math, which are not difficult things to measure. And that's just basic incompetence, which is born, in my opinion, in bureaucracy, right? Because, I live in a world that's a more natural kind of world. As a rule, and on the average, parents love their children more than other people love their children. And so they will take care of them if you just let them. And it's not very hard to figure out how to teach a kid to read. Because, as I love to say, they've already learned to talk, and they do that on their own initiative. And reading, to teach reading, a lot of them just figured out for themselves, even reading.
Yes, they do.
But all of them figured out, or basically all of them, if you will just apply the sounds that they already know, which stand in their minds, not just for things, but for kinds of things. Slightly mysterious how we're able to do that. And just take those sounds and apply them to the letters on the page, and a few weeks or months later, they'll be reading. Because they're made to read. Of course they can read. We have trouble teaching that today. And that's it reminds me of something. I probably said this before, one of the first people to predict the fall of the Soviet Union was a man named Nick Eberstadt.
Oh, yes.
There's another guy who did it too. And he said that infant mortality rates were rising in the Soviet Union, and that's a sign of the basic breakdown of the modern society. And that's unprecedented, he said at the time. And I believed him back then. Well, our inability to teach kids to read is such a thing, I think, and very grave. And of course, the hottest topic, of all of the many controversial things that I've done that makes the left angry, is sponsor charter schools. More than 100 of them now. And, they can teach kids to read. And
the kids show up. I'll close on this note this week. The biggest stat from last week, 25% of American students are now chronically absent from school after COVID. 25% don't show up. That's a crisis, Dr. Arnn. And that's public education.
It's not. And, you can, and we took a year off or two and told them it doesn't matter, right? So we put official sanction behind that practice, and so our reaction to that and everything else is to, pretty soon there'll be a national debate and somebody will get elected saying, I'm going to toughen up on the schools and I'm going to have truant officers. I'm going to make them come, right? And the truth is that what they won't do is look at themselves and the way they've organized it and wonder if they're not at fault.
Amen.
And make reforms there.
Have you seen this book yet? The Anxious Generation by a liberal John Haidt. Have you seen this?
Yeah, I've heard about it.
It is.
He's an interesting guy.
Step number 1, no screens in school. They've got to read the books.
Yeah.
It's like,
that's right. We don't.
Just number 1.
I'm a terrible example in the world because I never read anything except on a screen, and I read all the time.
Well,
all my books on a screen.
Go get The Anxious Generation.
I don't encourage the students.
No, don't let them do it. I will be back next week because we're going to go from the awful, awful, awful Battle of Verdun to the much more elegant and much more debated Battle of Jutland. And our friend Richard has been wondering when we're going to get to Jutland. Well, it's next week. Thank you, Dr. Arnn. Thank all of you. The Hillsdale Dialogue, everything is at hughforhillsdale.com. Go to hillsdale.edu for your application and by all means, find a classical Hillsdale Academy near you.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.